The Blackwood Mansion had stood empty for over a century, its Gothic spires piercing the grey Massachusetts sky like broken promises. Martha and Frank Collins had nowhere else to turn. With medical bills drowning them and their savings gone, the mysterious $5,000 cash offered to clean and organize the estate was their last hope. But Martha wasn't just any desperate housewife. She'd spent 30 years as a forensic accountant, trained to spot patterns others missed, to find secrets buried in plain sight. The moment they stepped inside, Martha knew something was wrong. The dust patterns were too deliberate. Rooms had been sealed from the inside, and those stains on the library floor, they weren't water damage. When Frank pried open a hidden panel behind the fireplace, they found stacks of documents, photographs, and a leather journal that revealed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. Names that were still powerful, families that still controlled fortunes. Someone had been watching the mansion, someone who thought its secrets were buried forever. But why were Martha and Frank really chosen for this job, and what happens when the watchers realize what they've found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rusted iron gates groaned like wounded animals as Frank pushed them open, their protest echoing across the overgrown grounds. Martha pulled her threadbare coat tighter against the October chill, her arthritic fingers clutching the brass key they'd found under the loose stone, exactly where the anonymous letter had promised. $5,000, Frank muttered, more to himself than to Martha, for cleaning. Who pays that kind of money just to tidy up an old house? Martha studied the mansion's facade, noting how certain windows had been boarded from the inside while others remained untouched. Her forensic training whispered warnings. "Someone who doesn't want authorities poking around," she said quietly. The front door opened with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently oiled. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of aged wood and something else, something metallic that made Martha's stomach tighten. Frank fumbled for his flashlight while she ran her fingers along the wall, searching for a light switch. Here. The chandelier blazed to life, crystal teardrops catching the light and throwing dancing shadows across walls lined with oil paintings. The electricity worked, in a house supposedly abandoned for decades. "Frank," Martha called, crouching near the library entrance. "Look at this." The dust told a story. While most surfaces bore thick, undisturbed layers, clear pathways cut through the grime, footprints from someone who'd visited recently and often. Martha knelt beside dark stains that had seeped deep into the hardwood, her trained eye recognizing the telltale spray pattern of arterial bleeding. "Could be anything," Frank said, but his voice wavered. "Water damage? Wine spills?" Martha pressed her palm against the floorboards. They were warped and buckled around the stains, wood grain raised as if the liquid had eaten into the fibers and dried repeatedly over many years. "This isn't wine, Frank." While her husband examined the room's corners, Martha gravitated toward the massive stone fireplace. The mantelpiece bore carved roses and thorns, beautiful work, but her accountant's eye caught the irregularity immediately. One section of decorative molding sat slightly proud of the others, a fraction of an inch off-center. "Frank, help me with this." Together, they pressed against the ornate carving. With a grinding click, a panel swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Frank's flashlight beam illuminated stacks of yellowed documents bound with red ribbon, photographs with cracked edges, and a leather journal whose cover had been worn smooth by countless hands. Martha lifted the top document with trembling fingers. A death certificate dated 1924, signed by a coroner whose name she didn't recognize. But the witness signature made her blood freeze. Harrison Blackwood, followed by a second name that made her mouth go dry. Senator William Ashworth. She knew that family name. The Ashworths still owned half of Boston's financial district. "Martha." Frank's voice came out strangled. "Look at this photograph." The black and white image showed 5 men in expensive suits, standing around something covered by a white sheet. Even in the faded sepia tones, the resemblance was unmistakable. One of the faces belonged to Harrison Blackwood, but another looked disturbingly familiar. She'd seen those same patrician features on television just last week. Congressman David Ashworth addressing the state legislature about historical preservation funding. The journal's pages cracked as Martha opened it. Harrison Blackwood's spidery handwriting filled every line, documenting meetings, payments, and something called the Providence Circle. Names appeared repeatedly. Politicians, judges, newspaper publishers, all dated 1924, but many of the surnames still graced headlines today. "We need to leave," Frank whispered. But Martha was already photographing pages with her old phone, her forensic instincts overriding fear. Outside, a car engine cut through the autumn silence. They both froze, listening to tires crunch across the gravel drive. Martha stuffed the journal inside her coat, while Frank quickly sealed the hidden panel. "The back door," she hissed, grabbing his arm. As they crept toward the rear of the mansion, Martha's mind raced. Someone had orchestrated this. The timing was too perfect, the access too convenient. They weren't just hired cleaners, they were meant to find this evidence. The question was why, and whether they'd live long enough to understand the answer. The floorboards groaned under their weight as Margaret and Harold stepped through the front door of Blackwood Manor. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light that filtered through grimy windows, and the air hung thick with the musty scent of decades-old neglect. "Jesus," Harold muttered, setting down his bucket of cleaning supplies with a metallic clang that echoed through the cavernous foyer. "This place is bigger than our entire apartment building." Margaret pulled a handkerchief from her pocket and pressed it to her nose. The smell wasn't just mustiness. There was something else underneath, something that made her stomach turn. Maybe we should have asked for more than $300. Above them, an ornate chandelier hung precariously, its crystals coated in grime and spider webs. The grand staircase swept upward into shadows, its mahogany banister carved with intricate roses that seemed to watch their every move. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, their subjects' eyes following the couple as they moved deeper into the house. "The realtor said the electricity still works," Harold said, fumbling along the wall until he found a switch. Ancient sconces flickered to life, casting eerie shadows that made the portrait seem to shift and breathe. Margaret shivered despite her wool coat. How long has this place been empty? They spent the first hour in the main parlor, working methodically to clear away layers of dust and debris. Margaret found herself drawn to the photographs scattered across the mantelpiece, sepia-toned images of stern-faced men in high collars and women with elaborate hairstyles. One photograph kept catching her eye, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, so different from the others. "Look at this," she called to Harold, who was struggling to move a heavy armoire. He wiped sweat from his forehead and joined her at the fireplace. "Pretty girl. Wonder what happened to her. There's something written on the back." Margaret turned the frame over and squinted at the faded ink. "Eleanor Blackwood, 1923. May she find peace at last." "Sounds like a memorial," Harold said grimly. "Come on, let's tackle the kitchen. We need to finish the downstairs today if we want that money." The kitchen was a maze of outdated appliances and copper pots, green with tarnish. As they worked, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the old house made her jump, and shadows seemed to move in her peripheral vision. It was while scrubbing the pantry that Harold made the discovery. "Margaret, come here," he called, his voice tight with excitement. "Look at this." She found him crouched behind a tall shelf, running his hands along what appeared to be a solid wall. But as she watched, she could see thin lines in the wallpaper, lines that formed the outline of a door. "There's a draft coming through," Harold said. "Feel this." Margaret pressed her hand to the wall and felt cool air seeping through the cracks. "How do we open it?" Harold stood and examined the shelf more carefully. After a moment, he found a small lever disguised as a decorative scroll. When he pulled it, the wall swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Should we?" Margaret began, then stopped. They both knew they couldn't resist. Harold retrieved a flashlight from their supplies, and together they descended the hidden stairs. The passage was cramped and smelled of damp earth, but the stone steps were solid beneath their feet. The staircase ended in a small chamber that had clearly been someone's secret study. A desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with papers despite the decades of abandonment. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, and in the center of the room stood a large safe, its door hanging open. "My God," Margaret whispered. Harold played the flashlight beam across the scattered papers on the desk. Even in the dim light, they could see official-looking documents, photographs, and what appeared to be correspondence. One letter, written in an elegant hand, lay open on top of the others. Margaret leaned closer to read it, and her blood ran cold. The letter was dated October 15, 1923, just months after the photograph of Eleanor Blackwood had been taken. But it wasn't the date that made her gasp. It was the content. The letter detailed a plan to ensure that Eleanor Blackwood would never be able to reveal what she had witnessed. The writer spoke of permanent solutions and protecting the family name at any cost. Harold picked up one of the photographs scattered across the desk. It showed Eleanor Blackwood, but this time she wasn't smiling. Her face was frozen in terror, and she appeared to be running from something or someone just outside the camera's frame. "Harold," Margaret whispered, "I think we just found evidence of a murder." Margaret's flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the hidden room's walls, revealing details that made her stomach clench. Newspaper clippings from 1924 covered one entire wall, their yellowed edges curling like ancient fingers. Headlines screamed about the disappearance of railroad heiress Victoria Ashford, who had vanished without a trace from this very mansion during a dinner party celebrating her engagement. "Harold, look at this," she whispered, stepping closer to examine a faded photograph pinned beside the clippings. A young woman with dark, intelligent eyes stared back at her, wearing an elaborate pearl necklace that seemed familiar somehow. Harold squeezed through the narrow opening behind her, his arthritic joints protesting. The space was cramped, barely 8 feet square, with a slanted ceiling that forced him to hunch over. Dust motes danced in their flashlight beams like restless spirits. "Good Lord," he breathed, focusing on a wooden desk pushed against the far wall. Its surface was covered with handwritten letters, their ink faded but still legible. He picked up the top sheet with shaking fingers. "Margaret, these are love letters, written to someone named Thomas." She moved to his side, her hip bumping against his as they huddled together in the confined space. The letter Harold held was dated 3 weeks before Victoria Ashford's disappearance. Margaret read aloud in a hushed voice. "My dearest Thomas, Father grows more suspicious each day. He's threatened to cut me off entirely if I don't marry Richard by month's end. I fear we're running out of time. The plan we discussed, it's our only hope." A floorboard creaked somewhere in the mansion below them, and they both froze. Margaret's pulse hammered in her throat as they listened, but the sound didn't repeat. Still, the reminder that they weren't supposed to be here, that they were trespassing in someone else's secrets, sent ice through her veins. Harold carefully set the letter back down and opened the desk's single drawer. Inside, wrapped in a piece of black silk, lay a tarnished silver locket. Margaret gasped when he opened it, revealing a miniature photograph of Victoria Ashford on one side and a lock of dark hair on the other. "She never left," Margaret whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "She never ran away at all." Harold's weathered face had gone pale in the flashlight's glow. He pointed to something else in the drawer, a small leather journal bound with string. With trembling hands, he untied it and opened to a random page. Victoria's handwriting, more hurried now, less careful than in the love letters. "Father knows about Thomas. He's hired men to watch me. Richard suspects nothing, the fool, but Father has made threats. He says the family reputation is worth more than my happiness, that he'll see me dead before he lets me disgrace the Ashford name. I'm frightened. Thomas says we should run, but where can we go with no money? Father controls everything." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't just a century-old mystery. It was a young woman's desperate final words. She flipped through more pages, each entry growing more frantic, until she reached the last one. "Tonight is my engagement party. Father insists I wear great-grandmother's pearls, as if beautiful jewelry could make me love a man I despise. Thomas will be working in the kitchen. He's risked everything to be near me. We've planned to meet in the garden at midnight, after the guests leave. If something happens to me, if I disappear, it won't be because I ran away. Remember that. Father would rather bury his secrets than let them see daylight." The journal entry was dated the night of Victoria's disappearance. Harold's hand shook as he closed the journal. "Margaret, we need to leave, now." But Margaret had noticed something else. A loose floorboard beneath the desk, its edges worn as if it had been pried up repeatedly. She knelt down, ignoring Harold's protests, and worked her fingernails into the gap. The board lifted easily, revealing a small cavity underneath. Inside was a man's pocket watch, tarnished green with age, and something that made Margaret's blood run cold. A woman's finger bone, still wearing a delicate gold ring. "Dear God," Harold breathed. A door slammed somewhere in the mansion, the sound echoing through the walls like a gunshot. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone else was in the house. Margaret scrambled to her feet, clutching the evidence they'd found. Harold was already moving toward the hidden panel, but his movements were too slow, too loud in the cramped space. Footsteps echoed from below, deliberate and purposeful. Someone was climbing the stairs. Margaret's mind raced. They had stumbled onto proof of a murder that had been covered up for nearly a century. Victoria Ashford hadn't run away. She had been killed, probably by her own father, to protect the family's reputation and fortune. And now someone knew they were here. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the photograph, the sepia-toned faces staring back at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The woman in the center bore an uncanny resemblance to the portrait they'd seen in the main hallway, but this version showed her flanked by 3 men in dark suits, their expressions cold and predatory. "Harold," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cramped space behind the wall, "look at the back." He squinted at the faded inscription written in elegant script, the circle of 5. "Justice will be served. E. 5th, 1923. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had scrawled, "They all paid the price, except one." A sudden creak from somewhere in the house made them both freeze. Harold's weathered hand found Margaret's shoulder, squeezing gently as they listened for any sign of movement. The mansion seemed to hold its breath around them, dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through the crack in the wall. "We should go," Margaret murmured. But even as she said it, her eyes were drawn back to the other items scattered around the hidden space. There were more photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal tied with a black ribbon. Harold's curiosity got the better of his caution. He reached for one of the newspaper clippings, his fingers barely able to make out the headline in the dim light. "Prominent businessman found dead in river. 4th suspicious death this month." "My God, Margaret, look at this." He held the clipping closer to the light. 4 deaths in 1 month, all prominent citizens. And look at the date, October 1923. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized one of the names in the article. Cornelius Blackwood. That's the name on the deed we found yesterday, the original owner of this house. The sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable groan of old floorboards bearing weight. Someone was moving through the house above them, and from the deliberate pace of the footsteps, it wasn't the wind or settling wood. Harold quickly gathered the photographs and documents, stuffing them into his jacket pockets despite Margaret's worried glance. "We can't leave empty-handed," he whispered. "This could be important." They squeezed back through the narrow opening, Margaret's heart hammering so loudly she was certain whoever was upstairs would hear it. The storage room felt enormous after the confines of the hidden space, but they didn't pause to catch their breath. Harold carefully pushed the panel back into place, ensuring it looked undisturbed. The footsteps above had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that somehow felt worse than the creaking. Margaret pressed her ear to the storage room door, straining to hear any indication of where the intruder might be. The house offered no clues, maintaining its secretive quiet. "The back stairs," Harold mouthed, pointing toward the servants' staircase they'd discovered on their first day. It would take them directly to the kitchen and the rear exit, without having to traverse the main corridors where they might encounter whoever was searching the house. They moved like ghosts through the narrow hallway, decades of marriage allowing them to communicate, through glances and subtle gestures. Margaret's cleaning supplies remained forgotten in the front parlor. Their only concern now was reaching safety with their explosive discovery intact. As they crept past the kitchen pantry, a new sound made them both freeze in terror. The front door of the mansion groaned open, followed by the distinct murmur of voices, not one intruder, but at least two, and they were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "Told you they were here," drifted through the air, the words indistinct but the menace unmistakable. Harold's face had gone pale, the photographs in his jacket suddenly feeling like lead weights. They'd stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple historical mystery. Someone was still protecting these century-old secrets, and that someone knew about their presence in the house. The back door seemed impossibly far away as they heard the voices split up, one set of footsteps heading toward the main staircase, while another moved in their direction. Margaret's arthritic joints protested as they forced themselves to move faster, every step a careful balance between speed and stealth. Just as they reached the kitchen's back entrance, Margaret heard something that turned her blood to ice, the distinctive screech of the storage room door opening. Whoever was searching the house knew exactly where to look, which meant their discovery of the hidden compartment wouldn't remain secret for long. Harold fumbled with the back door's ancient lock, his hands shaking as the voices behind them grew louder and more agitated. The bolt finally gave way with a soft click, and cool evening air rushed in to greet them. They stepped into the gathering dusk, but neither felt relief. Whatever they'd uncovered in that hidden space had awakened something that had been sleeping for nearly a century, and now there was no going back. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 11 times as Margaret crept down the main staircase, her bare feet silent against the worn carpet runner. Harold's snores echoed from their makeshift bedroom on the second floor, but sleep had abandoned her completely after finding those photographs. Every shadow seemed to harbor secrets. Every creak of the old house felt like a whispered warning. She clutched the brass key they'd discovered, its weight both comforting and ominous in her palm. The beam of her small flashlight cut through the darkness as she made her way toward the library, drawn by an inexplicable need to return to that hidden room. Something had nagged at her since they'd fled earlier, a detail that had lodged itself in her memory like a splinter. The library door stood ajar, though she was certain they'd closed it. Margaret paused, listening. Nothing but the house's natural settling and the distant whistle of wind through loose window frames. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately noticing the musty air felt different, disturbed somehow, as if someone else had been breathing it recently. Her flashlight found the bookshelf that concealed the hidden door. To her surprise, it remained partially open, revealing the narrow gap they'd discovered. Had they left it that way in their haste? She couldn't remember, but unease crawled up her spine like cold fingers. Inside the secret room, Margaret's light swept across the photographs scattered on the floor where Harold had dropped them. She knelt and gathered them carefully, studying each image with renewed focus. There, in the third photograph, was what had been bothering her. In the background, barely visible behind the group of well-dressed conspirators, stood a younger man she hadn't noticed before. His face was turned partially away, but something about his profile struck her as familiar. Margaret pulled out her reading glasses and examined the photo more closely. The man wore a distinctive watch chain, and there was a peculiar scar along his jawline. She'd seen that scar somewhere recently, but where? A soft thud from somewhere in the house made her freeze. The photograph trembled in her hands as she strained to listen. Another sound. Definitely footsteps, careful and deliberate. Someone was in the house with them. Her first instinct was to call out for Harold, but survival instincts from their years of living in rough neighborhoods kept her silent. If someone had broken in, alerting them to her location would be foolish. Instead, she quickly gathered the remaining photographs and documents, stuffing them into the large pocket of her robe. The footsteps were closer now, moving through the main hall with purpose. Margaret clicked off her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall of the hidden room, grateful for the concealing bookshelf. Through the gap, she could see a faint glow approaching the library. Someone else with a light. The library door creaked fully open. Margaret held her breath as the intruder's flashlight beam swept the room methodically, lingering on the disturbed dust patterns where she and Harold had walked earlier. The light paused at the bookshelf, and Margaret's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away. "I know you're here somewhere," a man's voice said softly, cultured, but with an edge of menace. "The photographs are missing." Margaret's blood turned to ice. How could he possibly know about the photographs? Unless he'd been watching them, waiting for them to find what he'd been searching for himself. The beam of light probed closer to the hidden entrance. Margaret realized with growing horror that the intruder knew about the secret room. This wasn't a random break-in. This was someone intimately familiar with the house's secrets. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it?" The voice continued conversationally. "Margaret Chen, 68 years old, recently evicted from your apartment on Maple Street. You and your husband Harold took this job because you're desperate for money." "I understand desperation, Mrs. Chen. It makes people do foolish things." The casual recitation of her personal details sent terror shooting through her veins. This man had been watching them, researching them. But how long had he known they were here? The footsteps moved closer to the bookshelf. Margaret pressed deeper into the shadows, clutching the stolen documents. If he found her, would he kill her for what she'd seen? The cold calculation in his voice suggested he wouldn't hesitate. "The thing is," the man continued, "those photographs you found don't belong to you. They're family heirlooms, you might say, and I'm here to collect them." Family heirlooms. Margaret's mind raced. Was this man a descendant of one of the conspirators? Someone whose family legacy depended on keeping those century-old secrets buried? The light beam swept directly across the bookshelf gap. Margaret closed her eyes and pressed herself as flat as possible against the wall, certain discovery was imminent. But after a moment that felt like an eternity, the light moved on. "I'll find them eventually, Mrs. Chen," the voice said, growing fainter as the footsteps retreated. "And when I do, we'll have a conversation about the importance of minding one's own business." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Eleanor crept down the servants' staircase, her flashlight beam dancing across the worn wooden steps. Sleep had eluded her completely after their discovery in the hidden room. Every creak of the old house settling made her jump. Every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. Frank had finally dozed off around 11, exhausted from their ordeal, but Eleanor's mind raced with questions. Who was Adelaide Blackwood, and why had someone wanted her dead badly enough to wall up evidence of her murder? More troubling still, why had Mr. Ashford been so insistent they avoid the third floor? She paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening. The house felt different at night, alive with whispers from the past. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as she made her way toward the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea might calm her nerves. The kitchen was a cavernous space with an ancient cast-iron stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Eleanor set her flashlight on the counter and began searching the cabinets for anything resembling tea. Behind dusty china and tarnished silver, she found a tin of Earl Grey that seemed relatively fresh. As she filled an old kettle with water from the rusty tap, a sound from somewhere deeper in the house made her freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor above. Eleanor's hand trembled as she set down the kettle. Frank was still asleep upstairs, she was certain of it. His snores had been audible when she'd left their makeshift bedroom. These footsteps were different, lighter, more purposeful. She grabbed her flashlight and crept toward the kitchen doorway, straining to listen. The footsteps had stopped, but now she heard something else. Papers rustling, drawers opening and closing. Someone was searching the house. Fear crystallized in her chest. They weren't alone. Someone else knew about the hidden room, about Adelaide's murder, and they were looking for something. Eleanor thought of the diary they'd left upstairs, tucked safely in Frank's coat pocket, and felt a surge of panic. She had to warn Frank. Moving as quietly as her arthritic joints would allow, Eleanor made her way back toward the servants' stairs. The main staircase would be faster, but it was also more exposed. As she reached the narrow stairwell, the footsteps above resumed, moving toward the front of the house. Eleanor climbed as quickly as she dared, her heart hammering against her ribs. Each step seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silence. When she reached the second floor, she could see a faint light moving through the rooms below. Whoever was down there had a flashlight too. She hurried down the hallway toward the small bedroom where Frank was sleeping, but stopped short when she saw their door standing wide open. The room beyond was dark and silent. "Frank?" she whispered, barely breathing the word. No response. Eleanor stepped into the room, her flashlight beams sweeping across the empty bed, the disturbed blankets, Frank's clothes scattered on the floor. His coat, the coat with Adelaide's diary, was gone. A floorboard creaked behind her. "Looking for your husband, Mrs. Hartwell." Eleanor spun around, her flashlight illuminating a tall figure in the doorway. The man was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked hair and cold grey eyes that reflected her light like a cat's. He wore expensive clothes that looked out of place in the decrepit mansion. "Who are you?" Eleanor managed, her voice barely a whisper. "What have you done with Frank?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name is Christopher Ashford. I believe you've been working for my grandfather." He stepped into the room, and Eleanor noticed he was wearing leather gloves. "As for your husband, he's safe for now. Whether he remains so depends entirely on your cooperation." Eleanor's mind reeled. Ashford's grandfather. That meant the elderly man who'd hired them was involved in whatever was happening. They'd been set up from the beginning. "What do you want?" she asked. "I think you know." Christopher's eyes never left her face. "You found something today. Something that belongs to my family. I want it back." "I don't know what you're talking about." Christopher pulled a small pistol from his jacket pocket, the metal gleaming in the flashlight beam. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you once more, and I suggest you answer truthfully. Where is Adelaide Blackwood's diary?" Eleanor's breath caught. He knew about the diary specifically, which meant he knew exactly what they'd discovered. The hidden room, the murder, the conspiracy, it was all connected to the Ashford family. "Please," she said, "we don't want any trouble. We just needed the work." "I'm sure you did." Christopher's voice was almost sympathetic. "Unfortunately, you stumbled onto something much larger than a simple cleaning job. Now, the diary, Mrs. Hartwell. Where is it?" Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking of Frank somewhere in this maze of a house, possibly injured, possibly worse. When she opened them again, her voice was steady despite her terror. "It's hidden. I'll take you to it. But first I want to see my husband. I want proof he's alive." The flashlight beam trembled in Margaret's grip as she swept it across the hidden room's dusty contents. Wooden crates lined the walls like coffins, their surfaces marked with faded shipping labels bearing dates from the 1920s. Harold stepped carefully around scattered papers, his arthritic joints protesting with each movement. "Look at this," he whispered, crouching beside an overturned desk. A leather-bound ledger lay open, its pages yellowed with age. Even in the dim light, Margaret could make out columns of numbers and what appeared to be names written in meticulous handwriting. She moved closer, squinting at the entries. "These aren't household accounts, Harold. These are payments? Look at the amounts." Harold's finger traced a line that read, "J. Morrison, $500, silence maintained." Below it, another entry, "Police Captain Brennan, $200 monthly. Investigation delayed." "My God," Margaret breathed. "This is a bribery record." A sudden creak from somewhere above them froze both elderly cleaners in place. They held their breath, listening to the mansion's ancient bones settling, but the sound didn't repeat. Harold's hand found Margaret's shoulder, squeezing gently. "We should photograph these," she whispered, fumbling for her old flip phone. Evidence. Evidence of what exactly? And for whom? Harold's practical nature surfaced even as his curiosity burned. "These people are long dead, Maggie." But Margaret was already moving deeper into the room, drawn by something glinting in the far corner. Behind a stack of mouldering newspapers, she discovered a small wooden box, its brass hinges green with verdigris. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow preserved it through the decades, lay a silver locket. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and an elaborate Gibson girl hairstyle. On the opposite side, an inscription read, "For my beloved Eleanor, your devoted Charles, 1923. Harold, come see this." Margaret's voice carried a tremor of excitement and dread. He shuffled over, his breathing labored from the dusty air. "Eleanor, that name was in the newspaper clipping we found yesterday." Margaret nodded grimly. The same Eleanor who had supposedly run off with a traveling salesman, abandoning her wealthy husband and young daughter. The same Eleanor whose disappearance had been dismissed by police after only a cursory investigation. "She didn't run away," Margaret said with growing certainty. "Someone wanted everyone to think she did, but she didn't." Harold opened one of the nearby crates, revealing bundles of letters tied with ribbon. He selected one at random and carefully unfolded it. His eyes widened as he read. "This is a letter from Eleanor to her sister, dated 3 days before she supposedly disappeared. She writes about fearing for her life, about discovering something terrible about her husband's business dealings." He paused, scanning further. "She mentions hiding evidence somewhere safe, says she's going to contact the authorities, but she never got the chance," Margaret finished. They spent the next hour carefully examining more documents, building a picture of corruption that reached from the mansion's owner through the local police force and into the mayor's office. Eleanor Ashford hadn't been a unfaithful wife seeking adventure. She'd been a woman who'd stumbled upon her husband's criminal enterprise and paid for that knowledge with her life. As Margaret photographed page after page with her phone's weak camera, Harold discovered something that made his blood run cold. In the bottom of the last crate, beneath layers of yellowed newspaper, lay a woman's glove, elegant kidskin, size for a small hand, with what looked like dark stains on the fingertips. "Maggie," he called softly. She turned from the desk where she'd been studying a map marked with red X's at various locations throughout the county. The expression on her husband's face made her stomach clench. He held up the glove and they both stared at it in horrified understanding. This wasn't just evidence of financial crimes. This was evidence of murder. The sudden slam of a door somewhere in the mansion shattered their contemplation. Not the gentle thud of a door blown shut by wind, but the sharp bang of wood striking frame with force. Someone was in the house. Margaret quickly stuffed the locket into her cleaning apron while Harold grabbed the ledger. They could hear footsteps now, heavy boots on hardwood, moving with purpose through the rooms above. "The panel," Harold whispered urgently, pointing toward their escape route. But as they moved toward the hidden entrance, a new sound stopped them cold, the distinctive squeak of the library's main door opening, followed by measured footsteps approaching the very bookshelf that concealed their hiding place. Margaret clutched Harold's arm as they pressed themselves against the far wall, their flashlight extinguished, hearts hammering in the absolute darkness. Whoever was up there knew exactly where to look. The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden mechanism. Then came the soft scraping sound of books being moved aside. They were trapped. The beam of Harold's flashlight trembled as it swept across the hidden room's walls, revealing more than either of them had bargained for. What they'd initially mistaken for old photographs were actually daguerreotypes, dozens of them, mounted in ornate frames that gleamed despite decades of dust. But it wasn't the antiquated photography technique that made Marge's breath catch in her throat. It was the faces. The same face, repeated again and again, belonging to a young woman with dark hair and haunting eyes. In some images she smiled demurely at the camera. In others her expression seemed almost pleading, as if she were trying to communicate something urgent across the span of time. "Harold," Marge whispered, her voice barely audible in the cramped space. "Look at the dates!" He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to examine the small brass plaques beneath each frame. The earliest was marked 1887, the latest 1889, but what chilled him to the bone wasn't the span of years, it was the progression they revealed. In the earliest photographs, the woman appeared vibrant, her eyes bright with life. As the dates advanced, something changed. Her smile became forced, her posture rigid, her eyes increasingly hollow. The final photograph showed her in profile, her gaze directed away from the camera, as if she couldn't bear to look directly at the lens, or at whoever stood behind it. "Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore," Harold read aloud from a larger plaque mounted beside what appeared to be a family portrait. The same woman stood beside a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and cold eyes. "Born 1869, died—" He paused, squinting at the tarnished brass. "The death date's been scratched out." Marge moved deeper into the room, her footsteps muffled by a thick Persian rug that had somehow maintained its rich burgundy color despite the years. Against the far wall stood an ornate writing desk, its surface covered with papers held down by a crystal paperweight. As she approached, she noticed something that made her stomach lurch. The papers weren't yellowed with age. They were crisp, white, modern. "Harold, you need to see this," she called, her voice tight with fear. He joined her at the desk, and together they stared at documents that should have been impossible. Property deeds, bank statements, legal correspondence, all dated within the last 5 years, all bearing the letterhead of prestigious law firms, and all concerning the Ravenshollow estate. But it was the signature at the bottom of each document that made Harold's blood run cold. "Margaret E. Whitmore." "That's impossible," he muttered, shuffling through the papers with shaking hands. "She died over a century ago." Marge picked up a bank statement dated just 3 months prior. The account balance made her gasp. Millions of dollars, all held in trust for Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore. Below the balance, in neat handwriting, someone had written, "For services rendered in perpetuity." A sound from somewhere in the house above them, a door closing perhaps, or footsteps on the main staircase, made them both freeze. Harold quickly switched off the flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. They waited, hardly daring to breathe, as the sounds grew closer. Definite footsteps now, moving through the rooms above with purpose and familiarity. Someone else was in the house, someone who clearly knew their way around. "We have to get out of here," Marge whispered, her lips barely moving. Harold nodded in the darkness, then remembered she couldn't see him. He was about to respond when they heard something that made his heart stop, the unmistakable sound of the bookcase mechanism being activated. Light spilled into their hiding place as the secret door began to open. Without thinking, Harold grabbed Marge's hand and pulled her toward the back of the room, praying there might be another way out. His free hand swept along the wall desperately until his fingers found what felt like a door handle. The narrow panel swung inward, revealing a passage so tight they would have to move single file. Behind them, footsteps entered the hidden room. "I know you're in here," a woman's voice called out, cultured and calm despite the circumstances. "There's no point in hiding. We need to talk." Harold pushed Marge ahead of him into the passage and pulled the door closed just as light began to penetrate their corner of the room. The passage was barely wide enough for their shoulders, and the ceiling forced them to stoop as they felt their way forward in complete darkness. Behind them they could hear the woman moving around the room, opening drawers, shifting papers. Her voice carried through the thin walls. "You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, but that doesn't mean you have to die for it. Come out, and let's discuss this like civilized people." The passage curved sharply to the left, then began to slope downward. Margie's hand found Harold's shoulder as she stumbled slightly on what felt like stone steps carved directly into the foundation. The air grew colder with each step, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of running water. They were descending into the very bowels of Ravenshollow, following a path that someone had taken great care to keep hidden. But from whom and why remained terrifyingly unclear. The photographs scattered across the hidden room's floor told a story that made Eleanor's blood run cold. She knelt beside Harold, her arthritic fingers trembling as she picked up image after image of faces. Some she recognized from the mansion's portrait gallery, others complete strangers. But what chilled her most were the red X marks drawn across certain faces, and the dates scrawled beneath them. "Harold, look at this one!" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The photograph showed a young woman in a white dress standing beside the mansion's grand staircase, the same staircase they'd been cleaning just hours ago. Across her face was a bold red X, and underneath someone had written Margaret Whitmore, October 15th, 1924, done. Harold adjusted his reading glasses, squinting in the dim light from their flashlight. "That's the date we found in the journal, the night she supposedly fell down the stairs." Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for another photograph. This one showed 3 men in expensive suits standing outside what looked like a bank. 2 of the faces were unmarked, but the third bore the same ominous red 10th Charles Brennan, November 3rd, 1924, done. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Automobile accident, perfect." "Dear God," Harold breathed. "This isn't just about one murder. This is about all of them." They spread the photographs out systematically, Eleanor's organizational skills from her decades as a librarian proving invaluable even now. A pattern emerged that made her stomach lurch. 23 photographs total. 17 bore red X marks with dates and brief notations about their deaths. The remaining 6 faces stared back at them unmarked, but still alive in the images. And some of those faces weren't from the 1920s. Harold picked up a more recent photograph, this one clearly taken with a modern camera. It showed a middle-aged man in a business suit standing outside what looked like a courthouse. No red X yet, but someone had written Thomas Whitmore III, knows too much about the family trust. "That name," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "Whitmore, like Margaret Whitmore. This could be her descendant." The implications crashed over them like a wave. Someone had been systematically eliminating people connected to whatever happened in this mansion nearly a century ago, and based on the recent photographs, that someone was still active. Harold stood up slowly, his knees creaking in protest. "We need to call the police. This is evidence of multiple murders spanning decades." But as he spoke, they heard it, the distinct sound of a car door slamming somewhere outside the mansion. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly gathered the photographs, stuffing them into her cleaning supply bag. "The lights," Harold hissed, clicking off their flashlight. "They'll see the light from outside." In the sudden darkness, they heard footsteps on the mansion's front porch, followed by the screech of the old front door opening. Someone was inside the house. Someone who had a key. Eleanor grabbed Harold's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. They were trapped in the hidden room with only one way out, back through the panel into the library, where whoever had just entered would likely head first. The footsteps moved through the house with purpose, not the cautious exploration of another trespasser, but the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Harold pressed his ear to the wall panel, listening as the footsteps grew closer. "The library," he mouthed to Eleanor. "They're going to the library." Through the wall, they could hear someone moving around, the sound of books being shifted, papers rustling. Then a voice, male, middle-aged, speaking into what sounded like a phone. "Yes, I'm here now. The place looks like it's been disturbed. Someone's been cleaning." "No, not our people. There are supplies here, professional equipment." A pause. "I don't care what it costs. If someone's getting close to the truth about the Whitmore estate, we handle it the same way we've always handled it." Eleanor felt Harold stiffen beside her. The voice continued, clearer now as whoever it was moved closer to their hiding spot. "Check the records. Find out who was hired to clean this place. I want names, addresses, everything." Another pause. "Because, Marcus, if these people have found what I think they've found, they become photographs number 24 and 25. Do I make myself clear?" The casual tone in which the man discussed their potential murder made Eleanor's knees weak. Harold wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close as they listened to footsteps moving away from the library. They waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes before they heard the front door close and the car engine start. Even then, they remained motionless for another 10 minutes, neither daring to breathe normally. When Harold finally clicked the flashlight back on, Eleanor saw her own terror reflected in his eyes. They weren't just witnesses to historical crimes anymore, they were next. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Margaret crept down the servants' staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs. Harold had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but she couldn't shake the image of that photograph, the young woman who looked exactly like their murdered daughter, Sarah. The resemblance was too striking to be coincidence. She clutched the brass key they'd found behind the loose brick, knowing it had to unlock something important. The mansion groaned around her as she made her way through the darkened corridors, guided only by the pale moonlight filtering through grimy windows. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like approaching footsteps. The key fit perfectly into the lock of the mahogany desk in Aldrich Whitmore's study. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled open the bottom drawer, revealing neat stacks of correspondence bound with faded ribbons. She lifted the first bundle carefully, squinting at the spidery handwriting in the dim light. "My dearest Victoria," the top letter began. "The arrangements have been made. Father suspects nothing. By the time you read this, Evangeline will be safely away from Boston, and we can proceed with our plan." Margaret's breath caught. She fumbled for the small flashlight Harold kept in his toolbox, casting a narrow beam over the papers. Letter after letter revealed a conspiracy that made her blood run cold. Victoria Whitmore hadn't been the victim. She'd been the orchestrator. The correspondence painted a picture of calculated deception spanning decades. Victoria had discovered her father's affair with a young seamstress named Evangeline Ross, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Victoria herself. Rather than expose the scandal, Victoria had seen an opportunity. She'd arranged for Evangeline to disappear, then staged her own death, assuming Evangeline's identity and inheritance. Margaret's hands shook as she read the final letter in the bundle, dated just weeks before the supposed murder. "The switch is complete. Father believes I am dead, and I am now free to live as Evangeline. The fortune is secure, and Thaddeus Blackwood has been well compensated for his silence. Burn this correspondence immediately." But someone hadn't burned the letters. Someone had kept them hidden for over a century. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Margaret spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Nothing, just shadows and dust-covered furniture, but the sensation of being watched crawled up her spine like ice water. She turned back to the desk, pulling out more documents. Property deeds, bank transfers, shipping manifests, all bearing Evangeline Ross's signature but dated after Victoria's alleged death. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria Whitmore had murdered Evangeline, assumed her identity, and lived the rest of her life under a false name. But why were these documents still here? And why had someone tried so hard to scare her and Harold away from this place? Margaret found her answer in the last drawer, a modern manila folder, drastically out of place among the Victorian-era papers. Inside were photocopies of genealogical records, birth certificates, and a recent legal document that made her blood freeze. The Whitmore estate had never been properly settled. According to Massachusetts inheritance law, if Victoria's death had been staged, her marriage to Jonathan Blackwood, Thaddeus's son, was fraudulent. The entire family fortune, including this mansion and millions in trust funds, belonged to Victoria's legitimate heirs. And according to the genealogical charts, Sarah Miller, their murdered daughter, had been Victoria Whitmore's great-great-granddaughter. Margaret's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her. Sarah hadn't been killed in a random mugging in Portland. She'd been murdered because someone had discovered her true heritage, someone who stood to lose everything if the truth about Victoria's staged death came to light. The sound of a car engine outside made Margaret's heart stop. Headlights swept across the study windows as a vehicle pulled into the circular drive. She clicked off the flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. Car doors slammed, footsteps crunched on gravel, growing closer to the house. Margaret clutched the documents to her chest, her mind racing. She had to get back to Harold, had to wake him, had to get them both out of here before... The front door opened with a prolonged creak that echoed through the mansion. "I told you we should have handled this weeks ago," a woman's voice hissed from the foyer. "Now they've seen too much." "The old man's truck is still here," a man replied. "They haven't left yet." Margaret recognized the voices with dawning horror. Detective Morrison from the Portland Police Department, who had investigated Sarah's murder, and District Attorney Patricia Blackwood, who had dismissed their case so quickly. Blackwood, the name that appeared throughout the documents, connected to the Whitmore conspiracy for generations. Margaret clutched the evidence tighter and began to move toward the servants' staircase, praying Harold would wake up in time. They had finally uncovered the truth about their daughter's death, but now they were trapped in a house with her killers. The basement felt different now, charged with an electric tension that made Dorothy's skin crawl. Harold's flashlight beam swept across the stone walls, revealing details they'd missed before: scratches in the mortar, dark stains that could have been anything, and most disturbing of all, what looked like claw marks near the floor. "We should have called the police hours ago," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps on the damp stone. Harold paused at the entrance to the hidden chamber. "With what? A bunch of old papers and our suspicions? They'd think we're two senile old fools making up stories." But even as he said it, Harold knew they were past the point of rational decision-making. The photographs they'd found showed faces, living faces of people who should have been dead for decades. The dates on the documents created an impossible timeline that suggested the Blackwood family's secrets ran deeper than a simple century-old murder. Inside the chamber, Dorothy's trembling hands sorted through the scattered papers while Harold stood guard. The beam of his flashlight created dancing shadows that seemed to move independently, making her jump at every flicker. "Harold, look at this," she said, holding up a medical record. "Dr. Edmund Blackwood, admitted to Riverside Sanitarium, 1924. But here's another document, a land deed signed by the same Edmund Blackwood in 1953. "Could be his son," Harold suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, look at the handwriting. It's identical. And this photograph..." She held up a faded image of a man in a white coat standing beside what appeared to be a laboratory setup. "The facial structure, the eyes, it's the same person, Harold, exactly the same." A sound from somewhere above them made them both freeze. It was subtle, the soft protest of old floorboards under careful weight. Someone was moving through the house. Harold clicked off the flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. They sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe, as the sounds continued overhead. Measured steps, purposeful movement, getting closer to the basement stairs. Dorothy's arthritic fingers found Harold's hand in the darkness. His palm was slick with sweat despite the basement's chill. They could hear their own heartbeats, unnaturally loud in the confined space. The footsteps reached the basement stairs. Each creak of the wooden steps seemed amplified, marking a countdown to discovery. Harold's mind raced through their options. They were trapped in the chamber with only one exit, and whoever was coming knew these passages better than they did. The footsteps reached the basement floor and paused. In the silence that followed, Dorothy could swear she heard breathing that wasn't their own, slow and deliberate, as if their hunter was savoring the moment. Light suddenly flooded the basement, not the warm glow of their flashlight, but the harsh white beam of a powerful lantern. The person carrying it remained hidden behind the glare, but their voice when it came, was cultured and oddly familiar. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I know you're down here. You've been quite thorough in your housekeeping." Harold squeezed Dorothy's hand, a silent signal to remain absolutely still. Through the crack between chamber's door and frame, they could see the light moving closer, accompanied by those measured footsteps. "You've uncovered things that were meant to stay buried. Family secrets, you understand. Some legacies are too valuable to let slip away because of curious minds." The voice was directly outside their hiding place now. Dorothy bit down on her lip to keep from making any sound, tasting blood. "I admire your dedication, truly. Most people would have run after finding the first hidden room. But you kept digging, kept searching. That persistence is almost scientific." Something in the way the voice lingered on that last word made Harold's blood run cold. The photographs Dorothy had found flashed through his mind. The same face across different decades, the medical equipment, the impossible timeline. The Blackwood family has always valued knowledge above all else. Knowledge of the human condition, of life's boundaries, of what lies beyond conventional understanding. My research has yielded remarkable results over the years. A shadow fell across the crack in the door. Harold could see the edge of a shoe, polished and expensive, just inches from their hiding place. But knowledge requires sacrifice. The people in those photographs you found, they contributed to something greater than their individual lives. And sometimes, to preserve that greater purpose, difficult decisions must be made. The door handle began to turn. Harold's grip on the flashlight tightened. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all they had. Beside him, Dorothy clutched the photographs and documents to her chest, as if protecting the evidence could somehow protect them. The door opened with a soft click, and the harsh light poured in, blinding them both. "There you are," the voice said, and for the first time it carried a note of genuine warmth, as if they were old friends meeting for tea rather than predator and prey in an underground tomb. The basement felt different now, charged with malevolent energy that seemed to seep from the very walls. Margaret pressed herself against Harold's side as they descended the creaking wooden steps, the beam of Harold's flashlight dancing nervously ahead of them. The musty air carried something else now, a metallic scent that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Maybe we should wait until morning," she whispered, though she knew they couldn't. Not after what they'd discovered in Eliza's journal. Not when they finally understood why someone wanted them dead. Harold's grip tightened on the crowbar he'd found in the kitchen. "We need to know what's down here, Maggie. That journal mentioned a final resting place beneath the foundation. If we're right about this..." They reached the bottom, their footsteps echoing in the cramped space. Harold swept the flashlight across the basement, revealing the same stone walls and dirt floor they'd seen before, but now they were looking for something specific, something the Blackwood family had hidden for over a century. Margaret noticed it first, a section of the wall where the mortar looked newer, different from the rest. "There," she pointed with a trembling finger. "That's not original stonework." Harold approached the wall, running his hand along the mismatched stones. They were smaller than the others, fitted hastily. He wedged the crowbar into a gap between two stones and applied pressure. The mortar crumbled easily, too easily for something that should have been solid for decades. "This was sealed recently," Harold muttered, working the crowbar deeper. "Someone's been maintaining this." A stone loosened and tumbled to the floor with a hollow thud. Then another. Harold grabbed them with his hands now, pulling them away to reveal a dark cavity behind the wall. The metallic smell grew stronger, mixed with something else, the sickly, sweet odor of decay. Margaret covered her nose with her sleeve. "Oh, Harold." He aimed the flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a small chamber, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Inside, Harold could see the unmistakable shape of human remains, not one skeleton, but several, in various states of decomposition. Some were clearly ancient, reduced to yellowed bones and tattered clothing from another era. But others, "Dear God," Margaret gasped. "Some of these are recent." Harold's hands shook as he held the light steady. Among the century-old bones were fresher remains, clothing that couldn't be more than a few years old, maybe less. A wallet lay near one of the newer skeletons. Harold reached for it, his stomach churning. The driver's license inside belonged to Thomas Chen, aged 34. The photo showed a young man with kind eyes. The license had expired just 2 years ago. "I remember this," Margaret whispered, looking at the photo. There was a missing person case in the papers, a graduate student researching local history. They said he'd gone hiking and never came back. Harold found another wallet, then another. Each told the same story. Researchers, historians, genealogists who had gotten too close to the truth about the Blackwood family. People like them, drawn to the mansion's secrets. That's why no one ever bought this place, Harold realized, his voice barely audible. Not because of the market or the condition, because anyone who digs too deep ends up here. Margaret backed away from the wall, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. "We have to get out of here. We have to call the police." "With what evidence? Our word against—" Harold paused. Against whom? They still didn't know who was behind this, who had been silencing people for decades. A sound from upstairs froze them both, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above, deliberate and purposeful. Harold switched off the flashlight immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness. Margaret grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin through his shirt. "Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher?" a voice called from upstairs, male, authoritative, with the hint of an accent Margaret couldn't place. "I know you're here. I saw your car outside." The footsteps moved methodically through the house, searching, closer to the basement door. "You've been very busy," the voice continued, almost conversational. "Very curious. That's unfortunate. Curiosity is such a dangerous trait." Harold pulled Margaret deeper into the basement, toward the far corner where old furniture created shadows even in daylight. They crouched behind a mouldering armoire, Harold's hand pressed over Margaret's mouth to muffle her ragged breathing. "I represent certain interests," the voice went on, now at the top of the basement stairs. "Interests that have been very patient, very careful. The Blackwood legacy must be preserved, you understand. Some secrets are too valuable to die." The first footstep on the basement stairs echoed like a gunshot in the darkness. Harold felt Margaret's body trembling against his. In his pocket, his phone had no signal. The basement's stone walls blocked everything. They were trapped, with nowhere to run and a century's worth of victims as their only companions in the dark. The headlights cut through the darkness as Harold pulled their old Honda into the driveway of the Whitmore mansion. The house loomed before them like a wounded giant, its broken windows reflecting the moon's pale light. They'd been gone only 3 days, but it felt like a lifetime. "Were you sure about this?" Margaret whispered, her fingers clutching the manila envelope containing copies of everything they'd found. They'd left the originals in a safety deposit box at First National, along with a letter explaining everything. "We have to get the rest of the evidence," Harold replied, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. "Without those photographs from the hidden room, we don't have enough to convince Detective Morrison." They sat in silence for a moment, both remembering their disappointing meeting with the police. Morrison had listened politely, but Harold could see the skepticism in his eyes. A century-old murder conspiracy, an elderly couple finding evidence that trained investigators had missed. It sounded like the ramblings of two people desperate for excitement in their twilight years. Margaret squeezed Harold's hand. "Together?" "Together." They approached the servants' entrance, the same door they'd used dozens of times before. Harold's key still worked, which surprised him. If someone knew they'd been inside, surely they would have changed the locks, unless they wanted Harold and Margaret to return. The thought made his blood run cold. The familiar, musty smell greeted them as they stepped inside. Harold swept his flashlight across the kitchen, checking shadows that had once seemed harmless. Everything appeared exactly as they'd left it, but something felt different, Wrong. The air, Margaret whispered. It smells like cigarettes. She was right. Beneath the dust and decay was the faint but unmistakable odor of tobacco smoke. Someone had been here recently. They moved carefully through the mansion, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Harold's flashlight beam danced across familiar walls and doorways, but now every corner seemed to hide potential danger. When they reached the main staircase, Margaret grabbed his arm. "Look," she breathed. Fresh footprints in the dust, multiple sets leading upstairs toward the hidden room they'd discovered. Their secret was no longer secret. Harold's hands trembled as he gripped the flashlight tighter. "Maybe we should leave. Come back with the police." "With what? They already think we're crazy old people. If we run now, we'll never get another chance." Margaret was right, as usual. They climbed the stairs slowly, Harold testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The old wood creaked and groaned beneath them, announcing their presence to anyone who might be listening. The hidden door behind the bookshelf stood open. Harold's heart sank as his flashlight illuminated the space beyond. The room had been ransacked. File cabinets lay overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. The photographs they'd so carefully documented were gone. The ledgers had vanished. Even the old newspapers had been cleared out. 70 years of evidence, Margaret said, her voice hollow. All of it gone. Harold knelt beside the debris, searching desperately for anything the intruders might have missed. His fingers found fragments of torn photographs, pieces of documents, but nothing substantial enough to prove their story. A floorboard creaked behind them. Harold spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate a figure standing in the doorway. The man was tall and thin, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the dusty mansion. His face was sharp and angular, with cold blue eyes that reflected the flashlight like chips of ice. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I was wondering when you'd return." Margaret stepped closer to Harold, her hand finding his arm. "Who are you?" "Someone with a vested interest in keeping certain family matters private." The man stepped into the room, and Harold noticed he wasn't alone. 2 other figures emerged from the shadows, flanking him on either side. "You've been quite thorough in your cleaning." "Too thorough, I'm afraid." Harold's mind raced. Family matters. The photographs they'd seen showed members of the Whitmore family involved in the conspiracy. This man could be a descendant, someone with money and influence who'd spent decades keeping the truth buried. "The evidence is already in safe hands," Harold said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "If anything happens to us, it goes straight to the newspapers." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Evidence? What evidence? This room contains nothing but dust and debris. As for your safety deposit box at First National," he paused, letting the implications sink in. "Bank security can be so unreliable these days." Margaret gasped. They'd been watched, followed. Their every move had been monitored from the beginning. "What do you want?" Harold asked. "Simply to clean up a mess that should have stayed buried. Some secrets are worth preserving, Mr. Chen. The question is, how much is your silence worth?" The basement felt like a tomb as Margaret clutched the leather-bound journal to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The footsteps above had stopped, replaced by an ominous creaking that suggested someone was systematically searching the rooms overhead. Harold's weathered hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers trembling but his grip firm. "We need another way out," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the suffocating silence. Margaret's eyes had adjusted enough to make out the shadowy outlines of the basement's far corners. The hidden chamber they'd discovered behind the false wall stretched deeper than she'd initially realized, and somewhere in that darkness might lie their salvation, or their grave. They moved carefully, Harold's phone providing the barest hint of light as they navigated between dusty steamer trunks and covered furniture. The journal's contents burned in Margaret's memory: dates, names, payments made to city officials, judges, police commissioners. The Ashford family hadn't just committed murder, They'd purchased an entire conspiracy of silence that reached into every corner of the city's power structure. A loud crash from upstairs made them both freeze. Someone was no longer bothering with stealth. "Down here," Harold breathed, pointing toward what appeared to be a second staircase carved into the foundation itself. Unlike the wooden steps they'd descended, these were stone, worn smooth by decades of use. As they crept downward, the air grew colder and carried the faint scent of earth and old water. Margaret realized they were moving beneath the mansion's foundation into what must be a network of tunnels that predated the house itself. The Ashfords had built their empire on secrets, layer upon layer of them, literally and figuratively. The tunnel opened into a small chamber where rusty pipes ran along the ceiling. Harold's phone light caught something metallic embedded in the wall, an old brass plate with an inscription too tarnished to read. But Margaret didn't need to decipher it to understand they'd found the mansion's original foundation, perhaps even older structures that had been built over. "Look," Harold whispered, directing the light toward the far wall. A narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person, had been cut through the stone. Cold air flowed through it, carrying the scent of the outside world, freedom. But as they approached the opening, Margaret heard something that made her blood freeze. Voices echoing down from the basement above. Multiple voices, coordinated and methodical. "They know about the hidden room," she whispered. Harold nodded grimly. "They've probably known all along. We walked right into their trap." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. The cleaning job, the supposedly abandoned mansion, even finding the key to the hidden chamber, none of it had been coincidence. Someone had orchestrated their discovery, perhaps to eliminate the last witnesses who might stumble upon the truth, or to flush out anyone who already knew about the Ashford conspiracy. A beam of light suddenly pierced the darkness behind them, flashlights, powerful ones, cutting through the basement shadows above. "Go," Harold urged, pushing Margaret toward the opening. "Whatever's on the other side has to be better than what's behind us." Margaret squeezed through the gap first, the rough stones scraping against her jacket. The journal caught momentarily, and she had to twist sideways to protect it, while still fitting through the narrow passage. On the other side, she found herself in what appeared to be a natural cave system, with irregular walls and a ceiling that disappeared into blackness above. Harold emerged behind her, breathing heavily from the exertion. The sounds of pursuit were closer now, boots on stone, voices calling out coordinates as if this were a military operation. They stumbled forward through the cave, Harold's phone light revealing a path that seemed to follow an underground stream. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process everything they'd learned. The journal contained enough evidence to destroy numerous prominent families, not just the Ashfords. Modern-day descendants of the original conspirators would have inherited both the benefits of their ancestors' crimes and the desperate need to keep those crimes buried. "There," Harold said, pointing ahead. A faint grey light filtered down from above. Natural light, not artificial. They were approaching another exit, this one leading to the surface. But as they climbed toward the light, Margaret heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the cave behind them. Their pursuers had found the passage. The exit emerged behind a tangle of overgrown bushes on the mansion's far side, hidden from the main house by a grove of ancient oak trees. Margaret and Harold burst into the pale morning light, gasping and disoriented. The journal felt impossibly heavy in Margaret's arms, the weight of a century's worth of secrets and lies. A car engine started somewhere nearby, too close to be coincidence. They weren't safe yet. They might never be safe again. But they had the truth, documented and undeniable, clutched against Margaret's chest. Now they just had to survive long enough to share it with someone who could act on it, someone who wasn't already bought and paid for by the conspiracy they'd uncovered. The hunt was far from over. The basement of the old mansion had never felt more like a tomb. Margaret pressed herself against the cold stone wall, listening to the heavy footsteps above them grow more distant. Harold clutched the manila envelope containing the photographs and documents they'd discovered, his arthritic fingers trembling despite his determination to protect their evidence. "We can't stay down here forever," he whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air. "There has to be another way out." Margaret nodded toward the far corner where they'd noticed an old coal chute earlier. "That might lead to the outside, but I'm not sure either of us can fit through it." The footsteps upstairs suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, they could hear their own labored breathing and the distant sound of doors being systematically opened and closed. Their pursuer was searching each room methodically, and it was only a matter of time before he thought to check the basement. Harold studied the photographs in the dim light filtering through a grimy window well. The images showed Jonathan Blackwood with several prominent town officials from the 1920s, including what appeared to be the police chief and a judge. In one particularly damning photo, they stood around a table where a young woman's body lay covered by a sheet. "This isn't just about one murder," Harold realized, his voice barely audible. "This was organized, systematic." Margaret leaned closer to examine a document bearing the official seal of the county clerk's office. It detailed the transfer of several properties to Jonathan Blackwood for far below market value, all dated within weeks of various disappearances. He was buying silence with real estate deals. Anyone who threatened to expose him either disappeared or suddenly found themselves with valuable property. A new sound from upstairs made them both freeze, the distinct creak of the basement door opening. Without hesitation, Margaret grabbed Harold's arm and pulled him toward a pile of old furniture covered by dusty tarps. They crawled behind an overturned armoire just as a beam of flashlight light began sweeping down the wooden steps. The footsteps on the stairs were deliberate and unhurried. Their pursuer knew they were trapped. Through a gap in the furniture, Margaret caught sight of expensive leather shoes and pressed wool trousers. This wasn't some hired thug. This was someone with money and position. "I know you're down here," came a cultured voice that Margaret recognized with shock. It was Dr. Richard Pemberton, the historian who had supposedly been helping the town historical society. "You've found something that doesn't belong to you." Harold's grip tightened on the envelope. They'd trusted Pemberton with their initial discovery, thinking he would help them understand the historical significance of what they'd found. Instead, he'd been monitoring their progress, waiting to see how much they would uncover. "Those documents are family property," Pemberton continued, his voice echoing in the stone basement. "Jonathan Blackwood was my great-grandfather, and everything in this house belongs to my family, including the secrets." The flashlight beam swept closer to their hiding spot. Margaret could see Harold calculating their chances, his mind working despite their desperate situation. He pointed silently toward a narrow passage between the stone foundation and an old furnace. It might lead them to the coal chute without being seen. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Pemberton said, his voice growing colder. "My family has spent generations protecting our name, our reputation. We've contributed millions to this community, museums, schools, charitable foundations, all of it built on wealth that my great-grandfather accumulated through methods that were expedient for their time." Margaret began to crawl toward the passage, staying low behind the furniture. Harold followed, clutching the evidence that could finally bring justice to victims from a century ago. "The Hartwell family has been particularly troublesome," Pemberton continued, apparently enjoying his captive audience. "That reporter was asking too many questions about property records. Sometimes the past needs to stay buried." The mention of the Hartwell family sent a chill through Margaret. They'd learned that one of the victims in the photographs was named Hartwell. The modern reporter who died in the car accident must have been a descendant, getting too close to the truth about his ancestors' murder. Harold reached the coal chute first and found it partially rusted open. Through the gap, they could see daylight and the overgrown garden behind the mansion, but the opening was narrow and they would have to move quickly once they started climbing. "I'm going to count to 10, Pemberton announced. "Then I'm going to start shooting into those furniture piles. One way or another, this ends today." Margaret looked at Harold, seeing 70 years of shared struggles and determination in his eyes. They'd survived the Depression, raised 3 children on factory wages, and fought through every hardship life had thrown at them. They weren't about to be defeated by one man's desire to protect his family's murderous legacy. Harold handed her the envelope and nodded toward the chute. "You first. I'll be right behind you." As Pemberton began counting, Margaret squeezed through the narrow opening, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the truth would finally see daylight. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees as Margaret and Harold made their way down the winding path from Blackwood Manor. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if they were finally emerging from a nightmare that had held them captive for days. Harold clutched the manila envelope containing photocopies of the most damning evidence, insurance policies, correspondence, and photographs that would finally bring justice to victims who had waited over a century. "The police station is just ahead," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. They had spent the night in the manor's library, afraid to leave in darkness, afraid that Thornfield's associates might be watching the roads. Harold nodded, adjusting his grip on the envelope. "Once we hand this over, it's out of our hands. Detective Morrison seemed like a decent man when we called. He'll know what to do with—" The black sedan appeared from nowhere, tires screaming as it rounded the corner and bore down on them. Margaret grabbed Harold's arm, yanking him toward the ditch as the car's engine roared past. But instead of continuing down the road, the vehicle slammed on its brakes and reversed. "Run!" Harold shouted, pushing Margaret toward the tree line. Behind them, car doors slammed shut, and heavy footsteps pounded against asphalt. They crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes. Margaret's lungs burned as she fought to keep pace with Harold, who, despite his age, moved with desperate determination. The envelope remained clutched in his hand like a lifeline. "This way," Margaret gasped, spotting a deer trail that led deeper into the woods. They could hear their pursuers behind them, voices calling out coordinates, the snap of twigs as multiple people gave chase. The trail curved sharply, and suddenly they found themselves at the edge of a steep ravine. Below, a creek bubbled over smooth stones, but the drop was at least 20 feet. Harold looked back. Their pursuers were getting closer, their voices growing louder. "We're trapped," Margaret whispered. Harold's eyes swept the area frantically until he spotted something, an old hunting blind built into a massive oak tree about 30 yards to their left. "There," he pointed. "If we can reach it—" A gunshot cracked through the morning air, splintering bark inches from Margaret's head. They didn't hesitate. Hand in hand, they sprinted toward the oak tree as more shots rang out behind them. Harold boosted Margaret up to the blind's ladder, then hauled himself up just as their pursuers broke through the tree line. The hunting blind was small and cramped, but it offered cover and a commanding view of the ravine. Through gaps in the weathered wood, they could see 3 men spread out below, all armed, all scanning the trees with professional precision. "Where did they go?" one man called out, his voice carrying an accent Margaret couldn't place. "They couldn't have gotten far," another replied. "Check the ravine. I'll sweep north." Harold pulled out his cell phone, relieved to see 2 bars of signal. He dialed Detective Morrison's number with trembling fingers. "Morrison here." "Detective, this is Harold Kimball. My wife and I are being hunted in the woods near Blackwood Manor. Armed men, at least 3. We have the evidence we discussed, but—" "Stay exactly where you are," Morrison's voice cut through. "I'm en route with backup. Can you describe your location?" Harold peered through the blind's slats. "We're in a hunting blind, oak tree, about a quarter-mile southeast of the manor's main gate. There's a ravine—" Movement below caught his eye. One of the gunmen was climbing the tree. "They've found us," he whispered into the phone, then ended the call. Margaret pressed herself against the back wall of the blind as the ladder creaked under the climber's weight. Harold looked around desperately, then spotted a heavy branch hanging just above the blind's entrance. He positioned himself beside the opening, branch raised. The gunman's head appeared first, then his shoulders. Harold brought the branch down hard, and the man tumbled backward with a grunt, crashing through smaller branches before hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Shouts erupted from below. The remaining two men converged on the oak tree, their weapons trained upward. "Come down now, and no one else gets hurt," one of them called up. "All we want is what you found in that house." "What we found belongs in a courtroom," Harold shouted back, surprised by his own boldness. "That's not going to happen." In the distance, sirens began to wail, faint at first, but growing stronger. The two gunmen exchanged glances. "Time's up," Margaret heard one of them mutter, but before they could act, the forest suddenly filled with the sound of car doors slamming and authoritative voices shouting commands. Detective Morrison's voice rose above the others. "Drop your weapons! Police!" The siege was over almost before it began. Within minutes, the woods swarmed with officers, and Harold was carefully climbing down from the blind with the evidence still safely in his possession. As Margaret's feet touched solid ground, she realized they had survived something that should have killed them, but more importantly, the truth was finally going to see daylight. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against the mansion's walls like a held breath. Martha clutched the leather journal to her chest while Henry kept watch at the window, his weathered hands gripping the rifle they'd found in the caretaker's quarters. The evidence they'd uncovered was damning enough to destroy several prominent families in town, but it had also painted a target on their backs. "They'll be back," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "That wasn't just some random break-in attempt last night." Martha nodded, her fingers tracing the cracked spine of the journal. Inside were detailed accounts of the Blackwood family's systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their iron grip on the town's mining rights. What had started as a simple cleaning job had revealed a conspiracy that reached back 5 generations, each entry in the journal documenting bribes, murders, and cover-ups that continued to this day. The floorboards creaked overhead, and both of them froze. Henry raised the rifle, pointing it toward the ceiling. They'd secured all the entrances, or so they thought, but this house had shown them that its secrets ran deeper than either had imagined. A shadow moved past the window, quick and deliberate. Then another. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized they were surrounded. The distant sound of car engines confirmed her worst fears, multiple vehicles approaching with their headlights off. The hidden passage, Martha breathed, behind the library. They'd discovered it 2 days ago while cleaning, a narrow corridor that connected to the old root cellar and emerged near the carriage house. It was their only chance of escape, but it meant leaving behind everything they'd worked to uncover. Henry shook his head. "We can't run forever, Martha. These people have money, influence. They'll hunt us down no matter where we go." "Then what do you suggest?" she hissed back, even as footsteps began circling the house. "Stand here and fight? We're 72 years old, Henry. Our fighting days are long behind us." A window shattered in the kitchen, followed by the soft thud of boots hitting the floor. Henry's jaw tightened as he made his decision. He grabbed Martha's hand and pulled her toward the library, but not before snatching the manila envelope containing photographs they'd found hidden in the mansion's walls. The secret passage was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to move single file through the musty darkness. Martha's arthritic knees protested with each step, but fear drove her forward. Behind them, she could hear voices echoing through the mansion's corridors, growing closer. "Find them," a gravelly voice commanded, "and find whatever they took from the study. Leave no trace." Martha recognized the voice. Sheriff Coleman, a man she'd known for 30 years. The betrayal cut deep, but it also confirmed what the journal had revealed. The corruption reached into every corner of their small town, including those sworn to protect and serve. The passage opened into the root cellar, its stone walls slick with moisture. Henry fumbled for the wooden ladder leading to the outside door, praying the rusted hinges wouldn't betray them with a screech. The door opened onto a tangle of overgrown bushes that provided perfect cover. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The carriage house stood 50 yards away, But between them and safety lay an open stretch of frost-covered grass. Car doors slammed in the distance, and flashlight beams began sweeping the mansion's exterior. "Now," Henry whispered. They ran with a desperation that defied their age, Martha clutching the journal while Henry carried the photographs. Every step felt like an eternity, their feet crunching on frozen leaves that might as well have been alarm bells. A shout erupted from the mansion. They'd been spotted. The carriage house door was unlocked, and they tumbled inside just as the first gunshot split the night air. The bullet splintered wood inches from Martha's head, and she cried out despite herself. Their old pickup truck sat in the shadows, keys still in the ignition from when they'd arrived 3 days ago. Henry gunned the engine, while Martha dove into the passenger seat. The truck roared to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness as they burst through the carriage house doors. More gunshots followed, one shattering the rear window and sending glass cascading over the truck bed. They bounced down the mansion's winding driveway, tires struggling for purchase on the muddy ground. In the rearview mirror, Henry watched as vehicles poured out of the tree line in pursuit, their headlights creating an ominous convoy. "Where can we go?" Martha shouted over the engine's roar. "They own this whole town!" Henry's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of heading toward town, he yanked the wheel hard left, taking them onto the old logging road that led toward the state highway. "We're going to the FBI field office in Portland," he said grimly. "It's time someone outside this corruption learned the truth." The chase had begun, and with it, their final gambit for survival. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Margaret clutched Harold's weathered hand. 6 months had passed since that terrifying night in the Victorian mansion, and today would finally bring closure to the century-old conspiracy that had nearly cost them their lives. District Attorney Patricia Mills approached the podium with a thick folder of evidence. "Your Honor, thanks to the courage of Harold and Margaret Winters, we have uncovered one of the longest-running cover-ups in our state's history. The Blackwood family's crimes span 4 generations, involving murder, extortion, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their empire." Margaret watched as Senator Charles Blackwood, great-grandson of the original conspirator, was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. His silver hair was disheveled, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a frightened old man facing life in prison. Behind him sat 3 other family members, all arrested in the coordinated raids that followed Margaret and Harold's harrowing escape. "The evidence recovered from the mansion's hidden rooms," the prosecutor continued, "includes detailed records of murders dating back to 1923, along with financial documents proving decades of illegal activities. Most damning of all are the recent communications showing the defendant's willingness to commit murder to protect these secrets." Harold squeezed Margaret's hand as Detective Rivera took the witness stand. The kind detective had become like a daughter to them over the past months, visiting regularly and ensuring their safety throughout the investigation. "The Winters discovered what we believe to be the original crime scene," Rivera testified. "Hidden behind a false wall was a room containing the skeletal remains of Thomas Hartwell, a journalist who disappeared in 1923 while investigating corruption in the mayor's office. The Blackwood family patriarch, Edmund Blackwood, was the mayor's chief enforcer." Margaret's mind drifted to that night when they'd found the skeleton, still wearing the tattered remains of a suit with a press badge pinned to the lapel. The horror of that discovery paled compared to realizing someone was still willing to kill to keep those bones hidden. The prosecutor displayed photographs of the documents they'd found, ledgers detailing bribes, lists of problems that needed solving, and most chilling of all, recent entries in Charles Blackwood's own handwriting planning their murders. The defendants tracked the Winters to the mansion, using security cameras they'd secretly installed years earlier, Rivera continued. When they realized someone had discovered the hidden rooms, they immediately moved to eliminate the threat. If not for Mrs. Winters' quick thinking in calling for help, we'd be investigating 2 more murders instead of delivering justice for past ones. Margaret remembered the moment she'd managed to dial 911 while Harold distracted their would-be killers. how her arthritic fingers had fumbled with the phone as footsteps echoed through the mansion's corridors, how Harold had used his knowledge of the building's layout, gained from hours of cleaning, to lead the Blackwoods on a chase through rooms they'd forgotten existed. When their time came to testify, Margaret stood on trembling legs. The courtroom fell silent as she described finding the hidden room, the terror of being hunted through the dark mansion, and the moment she'd realized their simple cleaning job had uncovered a legacy of murder. "We were just trying to make ends meet," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We never imagined we'd find something so terrible, or that people would still be willing to kill to hide it. But Thomas Hartwell deserved justice. Even after all these years, his family deserved to know what happened to him." Harold's testimony was brief but powerful. "In my 82 years, I've learned that secrets have a way of surfacing eventually. Evil can hide for a while, but it can't hide forever." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret and Harold attended every session, watching as the full scope of the Blackwood conspiracy unfolded. 4 generations of crime, corruption, and murder, all meticulously documented and hidden away in that forgotten Victorian mansion. When the verdicts came down, guilty on all counts, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Thomas Hartwell could finally rest in peace. His family, found through genealogy websites, could finally have closure. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around them, but Detective Rivera helped them navigate to a waiting car. Their story had captivated the nation, an elderly couple whose desperate need for work had led them to uncover one of the most significant cold cases in decades. As they drove home to their modest apartment, no longer under threat of eviction thanks to the reward money, Margaret reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed. They'd started as 2 invisible seniors struggling to survive and ended as heroes who'd brought justice to victims long forgotten. Harold reached over and took her hand. "Ready to get back to normal cleaning jobs?" Margaret laughed, surprising herself. "As long as they don't involve any more hidden rooms." Through their window the world looked brighter somehow, as if a shadow that had lingered for nearly a century had finally been lifted.